Hello, and welcome to Ortus Talks, the new YouTube show and hopefully soon podcast where I, James Kernick, will interview a large and diverse panel of experts in their fields. Today with me is Calum Farley, a good personal friend of mine for 14 years now?
Around there.
Around 14 years. We both got our master's degrees in Europe because we decided to say America sucks. Let's go find something else somewhere else. We did it. And today, look at us now.
Look at us now.
Look at us now. Who would have thought? Back at our parents' houses. So, Calum, would you like to give a bit of background on you, what you've studied, how you studied, and maybe even leaning into the methodology of what we're going to be talking about today?
Sure. Okay. So, as Jimmy already alluded to, I studied my master's in Europe, specifically Maastricht University in Brno, the Czech Republic. There I studied in their new conflict and democracy program. The program focuses on democratic institutions, as well as creeping authoritarianism, cyber conflict, hybrid conflict, kind of like non-state actors, that kind of sphere. So that's really kind of where my focus is. Regionally, my focus would be Central and Eastern Europe, looking more into Eurasia now, because I think in the future that's going to be a very important geopolitical region. And that kind of also ties into what we're going to speak about today. My focus again is with that, but also more specifically non-state actors and insurgent forces. So revolutionary forces, terrorist organizations, and kind of the way that they're structured and how they act, and how that differentiates itself from what would you consider to be the incumbent governments or the regular governments that we recognize today.
Real quick, as you were talking, a couple, ping words just jumped into my head. Sure. Especially with what I've studied in cultural studies and critical theory. When we're looking at the postmodern era and what's happening right now, where the government is almost, it takes, for lack of a better term, a managerial standpoint, especially with business, how does that affect insurgencies within sovereign countries?
Well, it comes to what I expect, what you said, managing, where these insurgencies kind of are managed. They're not quashed or destroyed immediately. And you can see this in Afghanistan. The existence of the Taliban has not gone away. And, you can see that through multiple forms when the Soviets invaded in the 80s. The Mujahideen state was there, supported by the US, obviously. And then moving on, the Taliban won the Afghanistan civil war. They've been able to stay there past the US second invasion in 2001. And even today, the current negotiations in Afghanistan for a peace deal are not with states necessarily, but with these non-state actors. The Taliban and the current Afghani government are the ones speaking on terms of a peace deal, whereas traditionally you would never see an incumbent state or the ruling authority making deals at a negotiating table with a non-state actor or some sort of guerrilla force that's trying to break away from the state.
Fascinating. But we're not really going to be talking about Afghanistan today. Let's try to bring in, for our case study, what are we going to be discussing as far as what you've written and what you've been studying?
So as far as what I've written, as far as the main force of study, is been comparing and contrasting the structures of terrorist organizations, insurgent operations, as in comparing that to violent gangs within the US, specifically in Chicago. And so the focus there is looking how they're structured similarly. This comes to their aims or their goals, and also kind of how they exist in a day-to-day routine and kind of operate within the space that they occupy.
So if we are to have this discussion, then why does this kind of parallel matter into looking at these non-state actors and these insurgents? Why do we want to make these kind of parallels, I guess is my question.
So the similarity there is they're both organizations that are trying to usurp the incumbent government's power. So if you look at the violent gangs or criminal gangs in the US, they are trying to exist outside of the state. They're trying to, and usually they take in their income, and that's through most commonly drug sales, illicit sales of that sort, money laundering, booking, betting. And then what they do with that is they have a turf, and with that turf is their essentially what they become the government of. And so you can look at that similarly when it comes to terrorist organizations. They're also taking out turf, because obviously eventually they're trying to revolt from the government that they are fighting against.
So you are even, if you were to take another step beyond this, you're telling us that violent gangs in the United States are revolutionaries.
That is where there's the divergence, because the terrorist organization has the ultimate goal of trying to usurp the government that it's fighting against. Gangs do not have that end goal. Their goal is more of their immediate survival within their surroundings. They don't have as much like political expansion as a end goal. The expansion for them, or political occupation for them, is more of a means to an end for them to able to be to live successfully. You could look at gangs more of like a corporation, of a business sense, whereas terrorist organizations are more inherently political.
I see. Fascinating. So this might be outside of the scope of what you've been studying, but just being familiar with the history of gangs and of institutional, but not necessarily state violence, I guess, extra state violence of maybe the mob in the United States, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So is that something, I guess, particular to the United States, how these kind of groups operate, or is it, do you see that happening in other nations as well?
I don't think it's something that's specific to the U.S. You could look at the Italian mafia. One example is Sicilian mafia. Also, a lot of these terrorist organizations, what they have to do, depending on the political situation, is they need to use crime to survive. So there's something that's called the crime terror nexus. And basically what it is where these terrorist organizations will use crime as a way to fund their terrorist operations. And there's certain groups, especially in Southeast Asia, where they've kind of done a full 180 now, where they're still have a very vague political belief, but they're mostly now criminal organizations.
Whenever we start talking about these, the idea of criminality itself, it changes over time. Especially you read someone like Michel Foucault, who wrote extensively on the prison system and the idea of crime and how punishment has deviated throughout history. So how can we, I guess, make such judgments about crime versus terror when the laws and the idea of crime changes throughout history?
Well, I think that's what makes it so sort of ambiguous. And one of the things that attracted me to that line of research and this kind of study is that if you look at a lot of, depending on someone's perspective, from a standard American foreign policy perspective, terrorism is a crime. And so if you look again, going back to Afghanistan, a lot of times when U.S. soldiers or forces capture certain terrorist individuals, what do? They put them on a plane, they send them to Guantanamo, and they put them through a civil trial. So it's kind of trying to further really take away that line between the two. And so that's kind of where I got my initial interest in the topic, and seeing if there was more to the connection between the two organizations.
I see. Now, especially germane to today's American viewers is a popular topic of white national terrorism. Have you studied that at all? Especially the white supremacy groups that have been given, honestly, political power in the United States.
I haven't done so much as the way they act and how they're organized. I have done some research on imagery and symbolism, specifically the way that white nationalists and far right groups will use internet memes as a way to subvert their messaging. So they, an obvious example would be Pepe the Frog, and where they try to use these symbols where they're basically stealing or appropriating internet memes into their culture, so that when it's posted, a lot of people kind of see it, the dog will, so you could say. Whereas though when it gets caught, or if someone blames them for it, they can say like, oh no, it's an internet meme. There's nothing else to look into there. So it gives them a way to get past traditional censors and really subvert those kind of blocks on spreading their ideology.
And they say the left can't meme. So why, I guess what I'm trying to get at with that last line of questioning, you don't see gangs going around making memes. You don't see gangs using, they do have symbols and they have ways to stress how they are different from the other groups, whether it is in the Middle East, whether it is in Southeast Asia, whether it is in the United States. What is the popularity, do you think, of the internet meme and the acceptance of that in the right-wing terrorist groups versus the I guess revolutionary terrorist groups? It's a big question. Yeah.
That's okay.
Now we're getting into territory where your opinion is that, yeah. Hey, we're the first ones to do it, folks.
Okay, so you can break that down again.
So everyone uses signs to, I guess, make themselves different, to make themselves more noticeable as who they are. For instance, you had the ISIS with the ISIS flag. You have the Nazis with the swastika. You have the new far right today with Pepe the Frog. Now, what makes it different? Why don't you see, I don't know, the American gangs such as, I mean, you have Hell's Angels, who has the Hell's Angels.
Okay, I see. Yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying. So I would say a large part of that is that the gangs, outside of their competition with other gangs, rival gangs in their community and their territory they're fighting over, they don't want to be seen, really, because the point is to stay away from the eye of the police, because when you deal with the police and law enforcement, then you have more issues you have to deal with. It's another enemy. And so that's another reason you'll see that there's a lot of gang violence, intergang violence, but you don't see gangs attacking police forces, or most importantly, you never see them really directly attacking the state.
Never going to see the East Side Crips storming the White House.
No, that's
not
going
to the Capitol building.
No, and that's saying, whereas these violent street gangs are more of a corporation as opposed to a political group, because they're trying to stay below the radar, essentially, stay below the purview of the states.
Do you have an answer to why that is?
Competition, or competition, more specifically survival, because while a terrorist organization has the political will, and that's what drives a lot of its people, the radicalization efforts, gangs don't have that. You could say that most of the time gangs are being produced or created out of financial necessity. And so with that, basically you're losing money, or you're creating an enemy that you don't need to be creating when you're going against the state. You fight other gangs because you're fighting for territory. When you're fighting for your territory, you're fighting for economic opportunity. But if you directly attack the state, you're not going to be getting that. There's no economic opportunity to be gained.
That's fascinating, because that takes into account not only something like Smithian capital, but then it starts incorporating things like Darwinian. How can we best adapt? How can we best survive in this area? Fascinating. Now, let's try to focus in on the parallels that you kind of mentioned before, and we've been, I guess, maybe beating around the bush. Whom did you study in Chicago as to be your case study for what you wrote?
So there's multiple different groups. One of the biggest sources was from Venkatesh. He did a study. He had to change the names on everyone, basically, but he did a study of a housing project in Chicago, and speaking with the people there, and specifically speaking with them about these two competing gangs. He called one gang the Saints, the second gang the Roaches, and basically both of them were fighting over a community housing project. And so
a single housing project. Okay.
Just in that specific case, there might have been other fights in the area, but he specifically focused on a single project. And basically, he spoke with the project council, the people who live there, running it. Also spoke with gang leaders, and from there, he showed a really interesting picture of power, and also not just power, but the provision of services. So something that I go into is not just that how these groups exist, but what they do in the spaces that they occupy. And a lot of times for both terrorist organizations as well as violent criminal organizations is they become the government. They basically replace the government that left the vacuum. They fill that vacuum, and they're very likely providing services. These could be financial services like short-term loans. These could be protective services. And Venkatesh, he speaks often about the fact that if there was a gang that was occupying a certain territory, they were basically required to escort any individual through that territory that needed help or protection, physical protection.
This is fascinating, because you'll see all these gangster movies like, oh, you owe us protection money. And so that has transmuted itself into this, where not only are they extorting people, but they're actually providing the services that the state should provide.
Correct. And there's a theory that comes from that. The name defeats me, but it's called the underworld theory. And basically, I'm sure it's pretty common ideology, is that the reason that all these gangs exist is basically because they're filling a vacuum, a spatial vacuum of power. So over time, you could say through redlining practices, through the loss of like the tax base and the loss of services in these areas, it's then creating the vacuum for which these gangs were forced to thrive in because the individuals there had no other financial or economic opportunities.
But the gangs did not create these vacuums. They're
No,
simply providing.
They're filling the vacuum.
Do the terrorist organizations create the vacuums then?
That is dependent on the terrorist organization and situation. There are some, because a lot of times it depends on the state. If it's a failed state, then there's that opportunity for a vacuum. Example for a failed state would be the rise of ISIS. So Iraq and Syria, especially during the Syrian civil war, there was a lot of unrest there that allowed for the creation of them. There are other areas or other situations where it could be politically motivated, and it could not be the vacuum of a state, but it could be the actual presence of the state, an authoritarian government that the people decide to revolt against. So it's a very case-by-case specific issue.
Interesting. So in your studies of this, I'm sorry, his name escapes me. What was the
Venkatesh?
Venkatesh?
Venkatesh.
Venkatesh.
The Venkatesh.
Venkatesh. That guy. Did he just study gangs in this particular area? Was that him focusing on this, or did he also try to look at the parallels between terrorism and inner city gang violence?
No, he focused specifically on inner city gangs. I really wasn't able to find a lot of scholarship on that comparison specifically, like the gang comparison. There's a comparison in how to deal with them from like a counterinsurgency or a counter gang perspective, but as far as the actual structures of the organizations themselves, there really isn't much there scholar wise.
So can you walk us through how a government would respond to gangs versus how it would respond to terror? I mean, we know about the drone strikes, go out and bomb the hell out of them, let God somewhere sort them out.
Yeah.
Versus you can't do that to your own population necessarily. So how is it different?
Well,
how is the response different?
It's not done in that sense, but it's still a very similar idea. And basically that what you're doing in a lot of these places with policing is going out, and you could even going back to the 80s with, mandatory minimums and these sort of things, and intensive policing in these communities. It's very similar into what's done in terrorist communities. So there's that approach. The newer approach, or the approach that's gaining more ground, is called community policing. And so this is where you have a lot of the requests that really came out of the Ferguson protests, as well as the George Floyd protests, is things like having community councils made of people in the community, not led by police officers, and they have an independent right to investigate any sort of police misconduct, as well as just general involvement with them. Also getting cops specifically physically out of their squad cars and making them walk the beats in the districts that they're supposed to be policing, because that provides a much stronger community sense of it when they're driving around in the cars. You can liken it to a U.S. soldier driving around Baghdad, because when they're in the cars and they only come out to arrest people or stop people from doing things, they become an occupying force.
So is that not what the police have been doing so far, is just occupying?
Yes.
And you'll hear these stories of especially older cops. Oh, it was never like this back in my day. But maybe they don't know because they were just there to be a group of eyes.
I think that's very community dependent. And it's something, if you are like us, if you're in, a nice upper middle class, like white region, you don't see cops. The only time you see a cop is if he's a speed trap and give you a ticket. So whereas if you're in another area with a higher crime rate, or
right down the road in Chiliota,
a larger police presence, you're going to have much more of that idea. So you're going to have a different relationship with the police force. And I think there's also a difference there between suburban and rural policing and urban policing.
Is that did you study those distinctions?
Not in what I've done, but you can see the distinctions in that, as far as, like I said, with squad cars. I mean, it's just a simple fact of math that it's harder to walk the beat in, somewhere like rural Kansas than it is to in, Manhattan. Or
even in the cities growing now that are growing out instead of up. You can't have that. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Now, specifically, I want to focus on the idea of state violence against gangs versus the idea of interstate violence against the terrorist organizations. And again, broadly, we're not specifically talking about specific organizations because we did have an insurgency here in the United States that has been treated completely differently than the United States treats insurgencies in the Middle East. So I think there's a lot of intersections that we could look at, but the great big parallel that we've been describing so far, what can you tell me about the difference of state violence against gangs versus state violence against international terrorist groups?
So with that is international terrorist groups, it's like you said, it's much more akin to warfare. It's drone strikes, it's military incursions. That depends. It depends on the state itself. You know, there's different approaches. There's the approach the U.S. is taking in Afghanistan, where there are drone strikes and assassinations, but there also is the effort to capture people alive and hold them in civil trials. But then there's the other states. You look at the strategy that has been taken in Syria, and that one is much more kind of fire and brimstone. You know, not worried about taking any survivors, and in that sense. There was the shelling of Aleppo when the Syrian National Front or the Free Syrian Army were in the last throes of their rebellion, basically hold up in Aleppo, and instead of going in and trying to pull them out and take them alive as prisoners or to provide any sort of amnesty, they were basically just shelled into the city. Just the city was destroyed and they were buried under it.
Terrible stuff, Calum. We're all war criminals here in the United States, folks.
It's not good.
It's not good. I think we have a couple more points that we can get out and then we'll be wrapping things up. If you could say anything now after what you've studied and what you've learned about the parallels that you drew, what would it be? And this is extremely open-ended. I know.
Yeah. Basically, the conclusion that I came to was that they're both structured very similarly in the way that I said they provide services and they basically become a replacement for the incumbent government. Also, there's very similar forms of them financing themselves and wealth generation and the relationships they have with their community. And so from that, what I said is there needs to be obviously further study. As I said, there isn't a lot of work in that comparison field. And from there, I think there's a better cross application and how they can be dealt with, specifically in the idea of community policing and applying that to counterinsurgency. Community policing is, like I said, providing community structures so that they're more involved in the policing process and so they trust the government more. And if you do a similar model with that with terrorist organizations or the communities that terrorist organizations hide within, then what you're doing is you're winning hearts and minds. You win the hearts and minds
because we do that so well.
You win the hearts and minds, and then the terrorist organization, they have nowhere to hide. They have nowhere to radicalize and create a base from.
So this is obviously this is a practical analysis versus a theoretical analysis.
Yes.
Which is something that I don't do praxis, folks. That stuff is hard. Are there any individuals or groups, think tanks that you know of right now looking into these, besides just that were just founded after the deaths of people like George Floyd and Ferguson? Are there any groups specifically devoted to getting these systems off the ground and into effect?
None that I can find. It's mostly scholarship, specifically within Defense Department and that sort of field, because that's where the policies are being created. The only really things I can say is while studying in Brno, I did do a internship at Globsec, which is a think tank in Bratislava, Slovakia. And while I was there, I helped them work on what they called their crime, terror, nexus reporting kind of project. And what they did there was interviewing former ISIS foreign fighters that left Europe to fight in Syria and either were arrested or came back or something along those lines, and interviewed them and looked at to see if there are any common or causal trends that could have sent them over there, what radicalized them, that sort of thing.
And what did radicalize them, if you could give it a grouping?
So the biggest things were the fact that a lot of the people that went were second generation immigrants. So their parents were the immigrants and they were the first generation born in their respective countries,
right.
Whether it was, Belgium or Germany, France, the UK. The big things were low education rates, low access to jobs. A lot of them were called, I believe, NEETs, not educated or
or seeking training.
Yeah, not educated or seeking. Yeah, basically. So there's a lot of those individuals. There were
not employed, educated, or trained.
There you go.
Yep.
That's the one.
In EET, folks.
A lot of those. They were usually men, younger 20s. A large number of them were actually radicalized through the mosques that they attended, and a lot of them were radicalized before either going to prison or being sent abroad. The interesting thing to note, though, is that a majority of them, the vast majority of them, did not actually fight in Syria. A lot of them, their involvement would actually have been in criminal activities to basically generate wealth to send to the fighters. And moreover, also using their criminal connections for things like faking passports and other sorts of records to help people either go back and forth.
Interesting. I think that might be all we can learn today about this particular subject. I want to make a couple of notes. You have noticed that we are outside. It is a beautiful day in Central Florida, and being inside would have been a crime. You've also probably noticed the disturbing wind chimes and bags breezing and people driving around their trucks. Can't do anything about those. But I hope you are comfortable knowing that we have been comfortable out here. Have you been comfortable?
Super comfortable.
It is beautiful.